Good morning. It's great to be with you all this morning. I'm Pastor Dave, and I have the just overwhelming privilege and blessing to serve as a student ministries pastor here at Brookhaven Wesleyan. And we want to give a special welcome to our college students who are coming back. A lot of them have come back. There were some even braved early service this morning, which I was really impressed with. So they'll be trickling in this week and next week, hopefully. So we're glad you guys are back. It's a lot brighter and fuller with you guys here. So welcome. The past 4 weeks, we have been in a study on the book of James, Active Faith, a teaching series from the book of James. And over the past 4 weeks, Pastor Tony has taken us through the first 4 chapters of James. And today, we're at chapter 5. This is the finale. This is the culmination of the book of James and what James has to say to the 12 tribes scattered abroad as he writes his letter. And as we start this morning, I'm curious. I made first service raise their hands. I think I'll just do head nods this morning because that was embarrassing in first service. How many of you, give me a nod, like you would say, I'm an avid reader. I love to read. I read a lot. How many of you? Okay, we got some people. Yeah, okay. Now, hand raise for this one. How many of you, like me, you like the idea of reading? You like the books you did read, but you just never make time to read. You're always, you'd put Netflix or movies or eating or something else above. Like readings, I like reading. I like having read books. But I don't prioritize it as much as I should. But I like accumulating books. I like the idea of reading so much, right? So I go to the used bookstore. I'm like, oh, there's a cheap book that looks good. I'll buy that. And oh, you know what? The books are really cheap here. So let me just load up and get. Oh, that's a book series. I might as well buy all those books in case I start reading it. And so these books they accumulate on my shelf and they sit there. And so I have a bookshelf at home loaded with books. And some of them I've actually read, and so people come over and they point, oh, you must like Star Wars because you have like 50 books sitting on the shelf of Star Wars. I'm like, yeah, do you want to talk about Star Wars? I'd love to talk about Star Wars. And they're like, weird. Other books I have sitting on the shelf though are things that they're that book you'll never get to. There's a series called The Wheel of Time that's sitting on my shelf. It's like 14 books, 600 pages a piece, and I'm like, I just can't undertake that. I bought the books; they're sitting there, but who knows if I'll ever actually get around to it. And when I see those, thick books on the shelf, it's kind of overwhelming. It's a daunting task to think, oh man, if I start that book series, it's 14 books, 600 pages, that's a lot of work. I think maybe in a similar way, as we've been going through James has been giving us these works, these things that our faith needs to have if it's going to be a vibrant faith. And so he's given us a lot of things to chew on in the last 4 weeks. James says, don't envy. Show mercy. Oh boy. Be slow to anger. Oof, tough one. Slow to speak. Don't quarrel. Don't slander. Don't boast. Oh man. Tame the tongue. Oh dear. These kind of daunting tasks, these things that James says, this is what you need to do. He's writing to the believers. He says, guys, your faith has to have these things. And this is just some of them. I picked 9 of them. I had a list much longer than this. So I look at those and I think, wow, that's kind of a daunting litany of things to do. In addition to that, I have this problem with my bookshelf at home because I get all these books and then they start toppling over because I have too many of them. So I try to kind of, take some of them and try to prop up like that. The solution, of course, would be to get just a couple of bookends, go out and buy some bookends to support my mini stacks of books I've never read, books I might never read, books that have been sitting on my shelf for 5 years and still haven't read. But there, got a couple of bookends. Solves the problem. They don't fall over. They'll sit there until I get a chance to read them. As I've been reading James 5, or the book of James as a whole for the last 5 weeks, something stood out to me. And it's that in chapter 1, there are 2 things that James mentions, 2 principles that James emphasizes heavily in chapter 1. That after he goes through all these works, all these things you're supposed to do, when he's wrapping up in chapter 5, these same 2 principles, he comes back to him and says, this is important. I don't know exactly James' motivation, but when I read that, here's what I pictured. Here's the rationale I see. Maybe you've had this experience. You're spouse is going out of town, let's say, or mom or dad, if your kid, your mom or dad leave you home alone for the first time, and your spouse gives you a list of things to do while they're away. Mow the yard, take out the trash, sweep the floors, do the laundry, I don't know, something like that. Makes you a list, okay? You get up in the morning, after they've caught their flight, they're gone. There's a Post-it note that says, hey, love you, don't forget to take out the trash. Why does the trash get a second, like, you've got this list of things, but the trash was really, is it because it's really important? There's something stinky in the trash that really has to go out by Tuesday? Or is it because that's the thing you know they're going to forget? Like, remember the trash. Like, don't forget this. I was kind of thinking, why is James so emphatic at the beginning of this book, these two things, at the end of the book, these two things, do these two things? So I don't know James's intentions 100%, but I want to imagine for a moment. Obviously, he did it for a reason. I think it's because it's important. What are those two things? Let's take a look at this. These things that bookend all these works. There's two things that do that. In chapter 1, in week 1, Pastor Tony was quoting the very famous quote from James, do not merely listen to the word, do what it says. Anyone who listens to the word but does not do what it says is like a man who looks at his face in a mirror, walks away, and then immediately forgets what he looks like. Remember, he used this video of the fawns, from Happy Days looking in the mirror. He's like, yeah, I'm good. James says, don't merely listen to the word, do what it says. So don't just read about showing mercy. Don't just read about being slow to anger. As you read, consider, how am I doing with these things? And let that change you. And I often hear that portion of James applied to these things. Be slow to anger, tame your tongue, do those things. And I wonder, what if we apply it to these two principles that we see in chapter 1, chapter 5? Okay, so what are they? Here we go. James 1, verses 5 and 6. James says, if any of you lacks wisdom, you should ask God, who gives generously to all without finding fault, and it will be given to you. But when you ask, you must believe and not doubt, because the one who doubts is like a wave of the sea, blown and tossed by the wind. That person should not expect to receive anything from the Lord. So the first thing James tackles in chapter 1 is our prayer life. When you ask God, how do you approach God? Is it a meager, maybe? Or is it a bold, like, God, I'm asking, I'm interceding, I'm approaching the throne boldly? For you visual types, just trying to come up with something to illustrate, something to kind of put these prayer bookends here. We're having a conversation with God. We're talking to God. We're asking God for things. This is a little like walkie-talkie that your parents would give you before they dropped you off at the theme park or the convention center or something. They can get a hold of you. Mom can page you, and it goes off. Like, yeah, Mom, I'm here. I'm okay. It's a two-way radio because, right, in prayer, we're talking to God. We're having a conversation. We're asking Him. We're communicating with God, but we're also, right, we're listening. We're asking. We're listening. Yeah, we're listening. Yeah, okay. We're listening. We're asking. And James says, when you ask God, when you go before Him, you can go before the throne boldly and don't doubt. Ask with faith. Go before the throne boldly. So that's chapter 1. He starts off, when you pray, be bold, don't doubt. The one who doubts should not expect to receive anything from the Lord. James goes on to say in chapter 4, verse 2 and 3, you don't have because you don't ask. You ask and you don't receive because you ask with the wrong motives so that you may spend it on your pleasures. Okay, so if we ask and we doubt, we shouldn't expect to receive anything. If we ask for the wrong reasons, with the wrong motives, we shouldn't expect to receive anything. So instead, James says, ask boldly with faith, but do so with good motives. Do so in accordance with God's will. When you pray, when you ask, do so in accordance with the will of God. So that was chapter 4, though. That was kind of snuck in here. James makes a comment about prayer. What about here at the end? What's the other bookend? Here he says, pray, ask boldly. What's the closing statement in chapter 5? Chapter 5, verses 13 through 18, James goes on this this back and forth response with his readers. Is anyone among you suffering? Then he must pray. Is anyone cheerful? He's to sing songs of praise. Is anyone sick? Then he must call for elders of the church, and they are to pray over him, anointing him with oil in the name of the Lord. And the prayer offered in faith will restore the one who is sick, and the Lord will raise him up, and if he has committed any sins, they will be forgiven him. Therefore, confess your sins to one another. Pray for one another, so that you may be healed. The effective prayer of a righteous man can accomplish much. Elijah was a man with a nature like ours, and he prayed earnestly that it would not rain, and it did not rain on the earth for 3 years and 6 months. James has this back and forth kind of a question, answer. Maybe a little rhetorical. The example that came to mind here is maybe you've had a conversation with your child like this, or if you're a child, you've had a conversation with your parent that goes something like this. They're dropping you off at school for the first time, or at the park, somewhere where you're going to be by yourself for the first time. And they're kind of asking you, so if a stranger walks up to you, if somebody you don't know walks up to you and starts talking to you, what are you going to do? Don't talk to strangers. Be polite, but don't talk to strangers. Oh, okay. Now, if a stranger offers you a piece of candy, what are you going to do? No? Right, don't talk to strangers. Don't interact. Okay. Now, if mom's late to pick you up from school, and a stranger comes up and offers you a ride home, what are you going to do? No. Okay, right, no. As a parent, you're not going to go through every single scenario that your child might encounter a stranger, right? You can't. If a stranger offers you pizza, what are you going to say? Yes, no. Ice cream, yes, no. You don't do that, right? I think something about what James is doing here, I think it's a similar fashion. He says, are you suffering? Pray. Are you cheerful? Pray. Are you sick? Pray. Are you tempted? Are you in sin? Pray. Do you need it to not rain for 3 years, as Elijah did? Pray. These are not the only 5 circumstances. These are the 5 times you need to pray. No, that's not what James is saying. Your response, your go-to weapon is prayer. I think that's what James is really getting at here. This is what you need to do. This is your natural response to circumstances, to situations. So, again, he's here. Pray. Pray boldly. Pray in accordance with God's will. And pray all the time in response to everything. Pray boldly. Pray with right motives. And pray with faith. Don't doubt. So this is the first of these 2 principles I noticed kind of bookend the entirety of James. But there's a second one that I dare say is as important as prayer, because without the second one, I'm not sure that the prayer really means much if we don't have the second piece to this. James 1, so back to James 1 now, James 1, 3, and 4. You know that the testing of your faith produces perseverance. Let perseverance finish its work so that you may be made mature and complete, not lacking in anything. Let perseverance finish its work so that you may be mature and complete, not lacking in anything. Okay, so chapter 1, James has these 2 things that he emphasizes. Prayer, perseverance. Prayer, perseverance. Pray boldly and persevere. Let perseverance finish its work so that you may be mature and complete. He goes on in chapter 1, verse 12. Blessed is the one who perseveres under trial. Having stood the test, that person will receive the crown of life that the Lord has promised to those who love him. So let's get some visuals up here for our visual people. We got our walkie-talkies for prayer. Here's some running shoes for you runners, for you sports people, you endurance types. I know you're wondering, not my shoes, but I hope the balcony can see the hot pink. People online, hot pink shoes. Endurance, perseverance. The Bible so often talks about perseverance, enduring the race. What is interesting is that this word, perseverance or endurance, depending on your translation, occurs I think about 4 times, 4 different sections in James. In Luke, 2 Corinthians, and twice in Hebrews. So you got these 8 times. Always, it's accompanied with this idea of looking forward, the completion. And 7 of the 8 times, it's specifically about the Lord's coming. Persevere so that you will receive the crown of life. Persevere because the Lord's coming is near. Job persevered and he saw that the Lord was. What happens when these 2 things intersect? 2 months ago, the youth group went on a missions trip to Cincinnati. Many of you prayed for us, you sent us out, you gave financially to make that trip possible, and we're very grateful for that. We saw some really cool answers to prayer in Cincinnati, many of them. We're going to share one of those with you today. You can check out the video screen.
For the last 3 years, I was an atheist. It was easier to just hide what I really believed because I felt like there was an expectation in my family to be a Christian. Even talking with my parents now, I don't feel that as much. I think that was something I was putting on myself a lot. And also, it was just incredibly easy because I grew up in the church to know what the right thing was to say. It was just more convenient to pretend to believe. A month ago, the youth group went to Cincinnati, and I went with them because I wanted to see friends and help people in whatever way that I could. But God had his own plans for that week. He really worked in me, and at the end we had this awesome service that was just a celebration of God, and I could not deny his existence anymore. I really felt like the Holy Spirit had made himself present in my life in that moment. And the next day, I went over to my youth pastor Ty's house and prayed with him and accepted Jesus into my life.
People we know and the transformation that's taking place as a result of God's work.
Thank you for praying for me.
I love your sermon.
That's not why I brought you up here, Jay.
I know
Thanks,
that.
but no.
But, so I knew he was going to ask us, and I didn't really know. I'm like, Nathan, what do I say? And so I've been listening, and I'm really excited that he asked us to share with you today. When I think of prayer and perseverance and what James is challenging us to do, to persevere in prayer, and when I think of perseverance, I think of pain and suffering. And 7 years ago, we adopted Ezra. And for all of you who've adopted, really what you're doing is you're inviting in redemption, but you're inviting someone's brokenness. Personal testimony over the last 7 years is you're inviting in pain, but how do we respond to pain? And what I realized at the beginning of his adoption was that I don't handle it well. I had a temper. My heart wasn't soft. I wasn't very tender. I was tender in some ways, but when hardship hit me and when his pain and his brokenness rubbed up against me, it wasn't a beautiful thing. And so 7 years later, we have Ezra, who all of you know. I hope that his surgery was a textbook perfect surgery, that our son Ezra's brain was filled with atrophy, and he had a cyst in his brain that no one even saw on the MRI, and God opened him up, and he cleared that area out of his brain, and it was a textbook perfect surgery. Then it was a textbook perfect CT scan, and just a little bit over a week after surgery, Ezra's thanking you for that. But what God has done this week is it's just been a miracle of his clarity and his bond with us. And so for 7 years, maybe many of you haven't known, but Nathan and I have kind of been silently struggling with wondering, is our son attached to us because of the way our home has flowed, and we haven't known. And so this week, Ezra has snuggled us, and he's hugging us, and he's doing really amazing things that we didn't know he would ever do. And what we realized through surgery was that he has been living in a fog, and he hasn't been healed and whole. And so as he's suffered and struggled silently on his own, we just didn't know how to respond, and we didn't do it perfectly. But God's really, I want to testify that pain, if we allow it to, and if we ask God, like, God, what should I be asking you right now? What are the right questions in suffering and pain? What are the right questions? And I feel like what he's done for me is he's shown my own ugliness and my own brokenness. And not that we have it all worked out yet, and not that it's like this progressive perfection, I think, and sanctification, but our home feels joyful, and it is so awesome to know that Ezra has loved us these 7 years, even though we didn't always feel it. And so that's my little testimony. You want to talk about that?
I'll be very quick. I like your sermon too. So I've been working with Ezra in some special kind of curriculum and therapy because that part of his brain was not just causing seizures, but it was restricting activity and development. And so we have some special curriculum that we go through, and it's very simple. We just look at a picture, and he has to explain the picture to me. And before the surgery, he really struggled to do that. And as a not trained teacher, I'm thinking, I don't know how we're going to accomplish what we're supposed to accomplish. The first time that we sat down after the seizure, or after the surgery, which, by the way, this is 10 days. So this evening at 4:30, we'll have 10 days of no seizures. Before, it was one per day. So we sat down for the first time to go through our curriculum, and I said, well, let's try something harder. I'm not going to show you a picture. I want you to imagine a picture in your brain, and you describe it to me with all of these things that you normally need to use to describe a picture. And he went through all of this very vivid imagery on what this picture was that he was seeing of this lady that pulled up to a house, and it's a white house, all these details. And he got to the end of it, and I said, okay, I'm going to recite it back to you. And I gave him all the information back, and he just shook his head no. And I thought, uh-oh. He said, well, you forgot the sidewalk. There was a sidewalk there. And I don't know how to convey to you how miraculous it is sitting on my side of the table that my son, who at one point sometimes we'd have to stop because he's having a seizure, sometimes he's got a blank look in his eye, and now he's so clear that he's catching me on missing a tiny, minute detail. And I had to pull back and not show him all my emotion because I would have scared him to death. And I just began in my mind praying, and it was, I don't know how long later, and I heard him say, so what are we doing? So that perseverance has really created kind of an explosion of joy in our family.
Thanks, Dave. Thanks. If we have these first-hand answers to prayer that we see, Braden Batman's story, Nathan and Jade's story, people who are getting saved that we're praying for, people who are being healed that we're praying for, and answers above and beyond what we prayed for. We prayed that he wouldn't have seizures, and here Nathan and Jade are sharing how much more above and beyond God has been doing in their lives. I admitted to you, I have been a prayer chicken at many points in my lives, not willing to commit to that bold step and ask and not doubt. I'm a pessimist. I doubt is what I do. But then I see these stories. I think, oh man, I've got to believe and trust God. He's given me these firsthand answers to prayer. How can I do anything but continue to pray boldly? Now, for the pessimist, for the cynic, because I am both of those things, for the cynic or pessimist who would bring up the very good point, wait a minute. Asking boldly, persistently, doesn't guarantee that God's going to say yes to my prayer. You're right. Consider Jesus Christ in the garden, pleading with the Father. Please, please don't make me do this. Is there any other way? Please don't make me do this. God did not answer that prayer. But like James talks about perseverance, the completion, the final, the end game, for that story, you got to fast forward at least 3 days, if not further. Like, in the end, God's compassionate and merciful. And so we have these testimonies, these vivid reminders of what God is